Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. We have a little hiccup with our episode numbering. I think the blast went out saying it was 119, but we already did episode 119, so here we are, episode 120, Friday, September 9th. Welcome to fall. The air has turned to a slight chill for those of you who missed the 90-degree days. Today we've got a great show. We're going to start out with local news. There's a lot of events coming this fall, and we're going to be talking about those. After that, or one of those I should say, is Jeff Rinvelt is going to join us live to remind us about the deadline that's happening today. Today at 5 p.m. is the deadline for the Renaissance VCF Undemo Day. So we'll be talking about that in just a second as well. After that, we're going back to our roots because remember, this show started talking about what FDA had to say about this thing called COVID, but we're not talking about COVID today. It turns out that every single day of the year and every single month, the FDA issues news items, or they find themselves in the news. And we're going to catch up on 4 of those topics today, things that either FDA wants to tell the public or things that have come up that the public knows about FDA. So we'll be talking about some of those today as well. But the first thing, A2 Biosocial is back. Happens to be sponsored by Into Being this week. Yay! A2 Biosocial, September 13th, next Tuesday, 4:30 at York in Ann Arbor. Hope to see you there. If you'd like to register, you can scan that 2D barcode on the right of the screen, even with your smartphone. It'll take you to where you need to be. Join us, Life Sciences and Beyond, York, 4:30 p.m. Tuesday, September 13th, the A2 Biosocial. I think back to full swing. It was actually funny. I think the last one that we sponsored was right before COVID hit, and now back in person. And moving forward. Also coming up this month, a Michigan Medical Device Summit, also one that Into Being is helping to sponsor, but it's put on by MishBio. MishBio is a great organization and a great summit, Medical Device Summit in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Tuesday, September 20th. I'll actually be part of a panel discussion there. We're going to be talking about building the future, a resilient Michigan medtech ecosystem and supply chain. In case you didn't know, it's something I'm certainly passionate about, and I know others there are as well. So we'll be talking about what does the future of Michigan's medtech ecosystem and supply chain look like. And coming up next after that, I got to tell you, Ford Field is going to be a busy place this fall, and not just football, but a couple of things are happening. Not in order of occurrence, but I'm going to tell you briefly first about this. November 1st, the MedHealth Summit is coming to Ford Field. Their matchmaking is always popular. There's going to be one-on-one matchmaking. It's sort of like speed dating between companies and investors and vendors and things like that. So looking forward to that November 1st at Ford Field. But something else happening at Ford Field, and this happening before that, this is going to be, I believe it's October 12th, but here to tell us all about it, Jeff Rinvelt of Renaissance Venture Partners. Jeff, do we have you there? Hey, there he is. Yes, I think you're there. I can see you, so that's a good thing.
Perfect. I've got too much sun on me.
That's okay. It's allowable. It's one of those weeks, I tell you. One of the questions, you've been on a few times to tell us about this, Jeff. Thank you for your support of the community and also MedTech Crossroads. One of the questions I never asked you, why do you call it Undemo Day?
I actually came up with a name, and it was I think we're on number 14 of Undemo Day, so it was a while back, but everybody was doing demo days, and I liked the idea of not having people demoing things. I like term sheets and having deals done, so I called it Undemo Day, and it sort of stuck, and now we're stuck with it.
I love it. So it's, in other words, don't come here and just give us a dog and pony show. We want to get down to brass tacks.
Exactly. You can pitch on a stage, but it's when you actually talk to investors and get term sheets and get investments, that's what really matters.
I love it. We're up against a deadline here. That deadline is today. We're going to talk about it here. We're also going to blast it after the show out to LinkedIn, this little chat we're having, because I think we got a couple slides here. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so today is the day for last time for companies to apply. What we're going to do after this is, send out all the applications. We actually have about over 100 now as of this moment, and there's always room for more. But we've got about 200 investors that are looking for one-on-one meetings with startups with any stage of growth, from pre-seed all the way to growth stage for venture capital. Free to apply, and with the more the merrier, basically. So out of that, we'll probably pick 40 or 50 companies to be in the room with one-on-one meetings, up to 5 meetings each. And then we'll also make introductions afterwards with people that don't make the cut that way. So we'd love to have more people. We've got a lot of investors waiting for deal flow, and then we're excited to send it out to everybody. If anybody's on VCs on the call too, we'll start getting those out early next week, basically.
That's awesome. We got a second slide here. Let's make sure we covered everything. Oh, that's my job. Is I got to advance that one. There you go. This is
perfect. And this is still open. This will be open, going right up until the October 12th deadline. But this is for people, community members, anybody who just wants to show up side of it, see, network with investors or see the companies. There's your way to apply there. Also want to give a plug for Tech Week, which is just coming out. Their applications is on their website, but the email blast will go out later this week. And they're having great speakers the day right after us. So it's a great couple days in Detroit, and you can see all of Michigan's ecosystem in a couple days.
That's really awesome. We've had people say that they're coming into town specifically for Tech Week and hitting these different events and coming to speak and other things like that. Good to know also, just to clarify, really, that between those two slides, there's a deadline today at 5 o'clock for companies to apply. But any of us, if we want to come to Undemo Day and connect, we can come not as registered companies, but just as the public.
Yep, perfect. Thank you. We'd love the more the merrier there. Basically, it takes a lot of work to get all these companies together and get all the investors with a one-on-one meeting. So we need a little bit of time to get all that together. But if you just want to attend, we'd love to have you. And it's a good way to sort of scope out scope out everything and see that. And then you can come back and then look for investments.
That's great. Jeff, we always appreciate having you. And thanks for being here. Hope it turns into a really great event. Good to be back.
Perfect. Thank you again for having me.
That's great. We're looking forward to that. So many in-person events happening this fall. Hopefully they all ramp up really nicely. Well, let's get to our main event today. Like I said, this is kind of where MedTech Crossroads started, was talking about the FDA and what they were saying about a very important topic at the time, which was this thing called COVID that we had no idea what it was and where it was going. Thinking about how to interact with that emerging, well, in some ways a problem, but in some ways a market for others. And so we're going back to our roots a little bit today to talk really just about what's in the news for FDA. Now, every month, FDA makes their own roundup of news items that they either want the public to know. Often these are warnings. Often these are different types of announcements, recalls, notices of clearances, other things like that. Sometimes the news comes through the news outlets, not through the FDA itself. But either way, all of these things inform how we, as a healthcare delivery community, move forward. We can learn about what the FDA is thinking. We can learn about how to interact with them. And as always, there are general principles that apply, even if the exact product we're talking about on a news item doesn't directly relate to what you're doing. More often than not, the principle can relate to something that you're touching, especially if you're in this community of folks innovating healthcare solutions. So today we're going to talk about 4 things. There is a new ALS drug that is moving forward through FDA, but not without some controversy, and we'll talk about that today. Also, the company Philips Respironics just got hit with a 17 million mask CPAP, BiPAP recall. The reasons for it, though, are very interesting, and we'll be talking about that today on the show. Also, stemming directly from COVID, UVC became very, very popular for disinfecting. Well, that's great, but it's not without its dark side, or maybe in this case I should say light side. There are some real dangers that, even having worked in this space during COVID, I wasn't aware of how dangerous some of these wands can be. And finally, breast implants have been under scrutiny for years, but it turns out there are some new warnings out there. We'll talk about those today. Everything here not medical or legal advice, as always. Just looking at it from the perspective of groups involved in new product development, in delivering better healthcare, whether we're investors, whether we're vendors, whether we're startups, whether we're medical professionals, whether we're mentoring and acceleration groups, whatever it may be. That's how we approach these kinds of things. So let's go to the first one. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, otherwise known as Lou Gehrig's disease. This is a terrible disease, and I don't just say that from the news items themselves. This has actually affected someone in my family in the last couple generations, and it's a really terrible nerve degenerative disease. Your body just sort of starts to shut down. In the United States, there are about 30,000 people who are suffering from this disease, and it's fatal. There is no known cure for it. About 6,000 people every year are diagnosed with the disease, according to the Washington Post. And the question then really becomes this: if a company had a drug that wasn't harmful, that it was safe, but it might have an effect, it might extend life for up to maybe even 10 months, should it be approved by the FDA? And the answer would seem to be, of course it should be approved. But what if questions were raised, not about its safety, but about its efficacy? What if there wasn't really great evidence that it worked? Should we still approve it to the market? Should people still have a chance to try it? If you can tell, this becomes a sticky situation where the wonders of regulatory science are maybe a little more complex. And that's what's behind the FDA's recent reversal on a new drug by the pharmaceutical company Amylyx. This is their logo, Amylyx. And as has been reported by NBC News, The Washington Post, PBS, and more, the FDA kind of changed their mind on this. Way back in March, they actually had declined to approve this drug. Their advisors said, no, let's not do that. It was 4-6, so a very narrow decision by their advisors. And NBC News found this very appropriate quote back in March. At issue was whether a single phase 2 clinical trial of 137 patients, that's not a lot, showed strong enough evidence that the drug, made by Cambridge, Massachusetts-based drug maker Amylyx, is effective. And so that makes sense. They said, well, we'd really like to clear it, but we're not going to. What is this thing? What does it do? Well, the drug known as AMX0035, it aims to slow the progression of the disease by preventing these cells from dying prematurely. It tries to keep them alive. Amylyx said that it helped folks to live 6 months longer compared to a placebo. But what did the committee say? The committee said, the majority of the committee members said the data showing a slowing in the progression of the disease was not persuasive enough to recommend approval. This from NBC News back in March. To learn a little bit more about what the drug is, we have this comment from the Washington Post. The medicine is made up of 2 components, a prescription drug called sodium phenylbutyrate that is used to treat rare liver disorders, and a nutritional supplement called tarurosodiol, I didn't quite get that, designed to protect neurons from destruction. The treatment comes in a powder that's dissolved in room temperature water and drunk or administered through a feeding tube. Well, that's interesting. Sounds like if it worked, it would be great, but FDA decided narrowly that that evidence wasn't there. Now, normally, if a company were to come back and were to suggest that, hey, we have new data, well, that would certainly merit new discussion, new observation. But FDA had an all-day meeting just a few days ago on September 7th. If you'd like to see the materials that were presented in that meeting, you can scan that very large 2D barcode. This was a meeting of the Peripheral and Central Nervous System Drugs Advisory Committee. These are FDA advisors. These are not decision makers. And they decided, well, we'll tell you in just a second what they decided. If you want to watch the entire 7-hour video, you can find it right there on YouTube. And again, I haven't watched the entire 7-hour video, but gleaning through it, it was actually very, very fascinating. It didn't take long to come across comments like this. No new data, and the analysis continues to be badly flawed. This was by a commenter, not by either Amolex or the FDA. This was by a call-in commenter during the public comment period. Another comment like this: why did FDA refer the invitation to the applicant to go through this again if there's no new data? And this comment: analyses were post hoc on unblinded data. The consensus seems to be that Amolex came back without offering more than the original 137 patient trial and simply said, we've done more analysis, we think you should look at it again. FDA said yes, and now it's being recommended for approval. Now, mind you, we're not making a judgment on this, just reporting what seems to be the case from the available data. The Washington Post concisely said this: a vow by a top Amolex official to pull the drug from the market if a larger study with 600 patients fails to show effectiveness was also a factor in the vote. But we don't know that that's going to be necessarily required if FDA does indeed approve this drug. We should know by September 29th whether the FDA is going to approve the drug by Amolex. But again, if it's already cleared to the market or approved by the FDA, would they really follow through and pull the drug from the market unless they're forced to? Many don't think so. Many don't think that once approval is there, they actually would. And this brings up a major issue in the domain and the world of regulatory clearances. We know we want to stop snake oil from being sold. We know we don't want devices that don't work on the market. But there's another role of the FDA too. It's to protect people from dangerous devices. So there's really two things, and we've talked about them a million times on this show: safety and efficacy. It's pretty clear from what's been presented that the drug by Amolex is, for all intents and purposes, safe as far as they know. But is it efficacious? That's the question on the table that's being raised. That's why this is such a newsworthy item. And the question before us really as a society is, do we want to give people the opportunity to purchase a drug that may not work? That's a question. We don't know that one way or the other for sure. If we know that it's safe. Some people say, no, we should still protect the public from drugs that we know haven't been tested enough to know if they're safe. And other people will say, you know, this is my last chance. Give me a chance to try something. And if there's any indication that this works, let me have that opportunity. So it really gets down to a very big question of what do we want as a society? So it's a sticky situation. And in fact, on the device side of the world, there's something called the breakthrough device pathway. That's a pathway that actually accelerates clearance if this device could be a more effective treatment, or if no approved or cleared alternatives exist. Now that's on the device side, not the drug side. But these are the kinds of principles that FDA is trying to put forward. If something is safe and efficacious and it's doing something that's life-saving, we'd like to accelerate it. That's generally a principle they try to follow. Now it turns out that according to the ALS Association, who, if I understand correctly, is actually for the clearance of any new drug that might help, there are at least 5 drugs cleared for ALS. That doesn't mean that they are the same thing. That doesn't mean that they all have the same efficacy. So this isn't a simple situation. Now, at this point, it does seem like the consensus is that the drug is safe, but there's not a lot of evidence for the claimed efficacy. So is it worth allowing the device to the market? And this is representative of a challenge that every novel medical product faces. Is just wanting people the chance to try your device enough justification to let it out on the market? Well, often that's not enough. If you're going through a de novo or a PMA, you're going to be asked to demonstrate not only safety but also efficacy from the get-go. Now, if you're doing a 510K, the situation's a little bit different because you have to show substantial equivalence. And if there's some question as to the effectiveness of the predicate device, there might be an allowable question as to the effectiveness of your device. But I thought what was fascinating about this situation with Amylyx and why I think it's making news is because on one hand, you have folks who are suffering and dying from an incurable disease. Should we allow them access to something that we are suspicious may not work? The data is inconclusive? Or is it our responsibility as a society to protect them from spending their money on and their time and perhaps their last months of life on something that we don't have enough evidence to say definitively is efficacious? It presents fascinating challenges, and I think it's very interesting. FDA's advisors did on the 7th make that about face, and by a 7-2 margin did recommend that this be approved. So we'll see. It should be by about the 29th that we'll find out whether it was indeed approved. And that brings us to our next news item, CPAP and BiPAP recalls. So this is an image of the Philips Respironics Dream Wisp, which we're using specifically because it was a part of this recall. CPAP is continuous positive airway pressure, and BiPAP is bi-level positive airway pressure. And if you've ever had somebody with obstructive sleep apnea, then you know that these things can be real lifesavers. Somebody who snores and has a hard time with that, they can really help just putting some positive pressure on the airway. Well, it turns out that Philips just got hit with a 17 million mask recall. And this just happened September 6th. And this kind of blew my mind. The leading reason for the recall was magnets. Magnets? What? What on earth? Why are you recalling a device for magnets? Well, the thing that went through my head, as a developer was, oh, you've got parts falling off of your masks and people are choking on these parts. And no, that wasn't it. I thought someone's getting magnets caught in their hair or something, and it's pulling their hair. I don't know. It made no sense to me just reading it. Well, it turns out that the problem is that they picked too strong magnets. What? That also still doesn't quite make sense. Get a load of this. This is one of those days that you're actually glad the FDA is there thinking about these sorts of things. The magnets from FDA.gov, the magnets can potentially affect the functioning of or cause movement of certain implanted medical devices, which could result in injury or death to the mask user or people near the patient wearing the recalled mask, such as a bed partner who have such devices. So it turns out that they picked magnets that were too good. They were using magnets that have the potential to affect other devices. They go on to say this: medical devices that could potentially be affected by these magnets include brain stents, aneurysm clips, pacemakers, implantable cardioverter defibrillators, shunts, other implants, magnetic denture attachments, insulin pumps, certain neurostimulators used in and around the neck, cochlear implants, or any metallic implanted medical device affected by magnets. The brainy engineer part of me wants to laugh. I'm not going to, because this is actually really, really tragic. And if we look at this statement here, this is actually really, really sad. Philips reported to date 14 serious injuries, including pacemaker failure, arrhythmia, seizures, and irregular blood pressure related to the use of the recalled masks. So this is actually no joking matter. These are related specifically to the Philips DreamWisp, DreamWear, AmaraView, and Wisp Youth masks. And as developers, as if you're in a startup, if you're a mentor, if you're a service provider, consultant, and you're working with somebody and you think to yourself, we're going to do something novel here. We don't want those snaps and buckles. That's great. It's probably going to improve the usability of your device. But who would have thought that getting that magnet that just holds so nicely, just holds a strap on so nicely, or whatever the magnets are being used for, those can be strong enough to affect, and it has 14 times now, affect some pretty life-sustaining devices. So we thought this was a good warning to bring if you know anyone who uses a Philips mask and also has other either comorbidities or somebody in the family who does. We're not giving medical advice here, but that sure seemed like something I would want to know in that kind of situation. So passing on that 17 million mask recall. And it really does bring up this topic of device interoperability, because FDA tells us when we're thinking about usability that we need to think about the interoperability of a device with other devices it may come into contact with. And we do our best, we try to do that, but here's a great example of they weren't even intending for this to interact with other devices, but the magnetic strength of whatever was being joined together by magnets is enough to mess up things like pacemakers. Well, that's worth knowing. That brings us to our third topic. And this one, boy, we saw a lot of these during the early and middle days of COVID. It's a great idea. UVC, probably an underutilized technology. And these started to make their way not only into hospital-grade room disinfectants, which do exist and are wonderful things, where you basically walk out of the room, this thing goes on a timer, don't be anywhere near or around it, and it's going to clean that room something fierce using UVC. Well, these started, as you know, to make their way into the public domain. And you'd see things like phone cleaners. You can still find phone cleaners out there. You stick your phone in the box, you press the power button, and the phone is sanitized using UVC. But increasingly, these wands were making their way to the market and are making their way to the market. I'm sure on Amazon you'll find a whole bunch of them coming in from overseas. These two images, though, are from names you probably recognize: Sharper Image and Phone Soap. Again, nothing against these companies, they're great companies, but advertising these UVC wands. And the only reason we use these as a news item is because they were specifically called out, among others, by the FDA. And FDA said generically, the FDA is warning consumers about the potential risk of injury associated with the use of certain brands of ultraviolet wands. Do not use these UV wands for disinfection because they may expose the user or any nearby person to unsafe levels of ultraviolet C radiation and may cause injury to the skin, eyes, or both after a few seconds of use. This is where it got really interesting. A person, I hope you're listening to this part, because if you've ever been around one of these things, you're gonna think twice. A person in the vicinity of UV sanitizing portable wand, this is one of the specific ones, I believe this is the Sharper Image one, which would include a user, may receive an injury to their skin or eyes from the wand in as little as 3.95 seconds at a distance of 5 centimeters from the light source. So if you're using this thing every day and waving it around, you're getting way, way, way more than that dose. If you want to read about it, you can scan that 2D barcode. But this is something that was being advertised just very, very casually. Here's the one from Phone Soap that is now not available for purchase. Good on them for pulling it from their website. That's kudos to them for doing that. Again, reporting the news here, nothing against the company. They look to be making some cool products. But just how casually these were advertised. And apparently, according to FDA, sort of ignoring established exposure limits for UVC. And what it reminded me of is way back in the day, this image from IEEE. There's a cool article at spectrum.ieee.org where you can go read about these devices. If you don't know what that is, those are viewing ports on something you stick your feet into. It's an X-ray machine for your feet. Back in the day, a couple generations ago, they would put these in shoe stores so that you could look at the image of your bones in the shoes to see how well they fit. Not a great idea, we know that today, especially with the dosages of earlier X-ray machines. But it does sort of stop and make you think, have we totally gotten smarter over the years, or are we still suffering from some of this, don't worry, it'll be fine. What could we hurt with it? So there you go. What goes around comes around. UVC being called out by the agency. And actually, I think these last two examples, places we're really glad that the FDA does exist. It's easy to be down on them. It's easy to say you're not doing enough. It's easy to say you're doing too much. Can't we get to the market? But for things like this, knowing that we can be damaging skin and eyes in as little as 4 seconds with devices being marketed by prominent mainstream companies, it's good to know that. So we're thankful for that kind of work by the many thousands of folks at the agency. And that brings us to our fourth topic. And this one is probably not going to come as a surprise to you, but a new breast implant cancer? Well, this has been an issue for a long time. Cancers, leakages, other things with breast implants. But on September 2nd, I'm sorry, that was the last one. We'll talk about the date here in a second. But according to the New York Times, some 400,000 women get breast implants every year. But here's the thing, only 25% of those are for reconstruction. 300,000 breast implants per year, strictly for cosmetic purposes. And of course, like we said, this isn't the first time they've come under scrutiny. Leaking silicone, a decade of cancer suspicion that FDA has been tracking. Turns out also according to the New York Times, that nearly 60% of women who get a breast implant need a follow-up surgery. I didn't trace that number down any further than that, but if the New York Times is correct in that, that's quite a staggering number. More than 50% of these surgeries need revisions at some point during the person's life. On top of that, it sounds like not only the materials in the implants can make a difference, but also the texture of the implants. Implicated in a recall by Allergan, they had 600 reported cases of cancer and 33 deaths that were linked to their implants. And this isn't even the news item we're talking about today. This is just breast implant history 101. So in addition to all of that, and the Allergan one seemed to have to do with the texture of the implants. Imagine that. In addition to all that, FDA has received, they say, and this is from FDA.gov, 10 reports of squamous cell carcinoma, skin cancer, and 12 reports of lymphomas in the scar tissue surrounding the implants. And they say this: while FDA believes that the occurrence of SCC or various lymphomas in the capsule around the breast implant may be rare, healthcare providers and people who have or are considering breast implants should be aware that cases have been reported to the FDA and in the literature. Currently, the incidence rate and risk factors for these things are unknown, but there are literature reports about it. And this is for both saline and silicone implants. And sometimes it happens very quickly, sometimes it happens later. It's both textured and smooth implants. So FDA really has these things under a microscope. I guess you could say it's another place where we're thankful that they do, especially given the prevalence of cosmetic surgeries. Fully 75% of breast implants are not there even for restoration. They're there for cosmetic purposes. And so FDA is rightly tracking the adverse events from this. Now, it turns out that this is something that not just for breast implants, but in general is worth knowing about. So if you've ever had some kind of an adverse event, you should know about FDA MedWatch. You can scan that QR code there to go straight to it. It's a place where both healthcare providers and the general public can make reports to the agency. And so if there's something that you've had as an adverse event, that's a place where the FDA can be told about it. Now, there's sometimes different databases for different purposes, but I think this is a really great place to end this news item, because this is a place where the general public, if you've had an issue with a device, in this case breast implants, but certainly anything else, FDA MedWatch is important to know about, because there are ways for the public to go right to the agency with adverse events. Sometimes, like it or not, sometimes if somebody has a conflict of interest, they don't necessarily want to report those adverse events. But the public can do this, and FDA MedWatch is one of those ways. You can access it through that QR code right there. Wow, that was quite the dump of FDA news, but hopefully useful to you as you think about either your personal life and what you're going through, or someone near you is going through, but also from the perspective of those engaged in healthcare and product delivery. These lessons are things that we keep seeing over and over and over again. When it comes to things like the breast implants, there are going to be adverse effects, and those may not be known for years. Now, maybe it doesn't affect you and it doesn't affect your exit if you're doing a startup company, but it is something that can eventually impact that product. And when we think about the UVC wand warnings, boy, COVID was a fertile time for there to be innovation. But we often notice that people might want to charge ahead saying, oh, it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine. But not a lot of people stop to think that UVC does have established exposure limits. And those can be very, very short if, in fact, you're going to be using it at the kind of dosages that kill pathogens quickly. The CPAP recalls sure is good to know if you know somebody who has a Philips Respironics. But I think additionally it brings up this whole question of device interoperability. Are we really thinking about how devices are going to affect one another? And with the ALS drug by Amylyx that's moving forward, it raises this regulatory question, and it's one that if you're doing healthcare delivery, you need to be thinking about. Do we owe society access to every treatment that could possibly be out there? Especially if they're coming near the end of their life and this might help. So as long as it's safe, ignore efficacy? Or what level of efficacy do we care about? And if you're involved in healthcare delivery, you're thinking about these kinds of benefit-risk trade-offs. If you're a doctor or a nurse, if you're a medical professional, you are thinking about these kinds of things. Thank you for doing that. We appreciate it. But if you're an investor, if you're a startup company, if you're a vendor, if you're a mentor, if you're a manufacturer, and you think you know the market, you think you know how you're going to be cleared to market, you think you know what your device does, your product does, believe me, you're going to be confronted with something very much like this issue that Amylyx is confronted with, not for the same reasons and all the same things, but the general principle applies. And maybe here's the most important thing. The rules around that are not hard and fast. They often come down to a dialogue with the agency. Sometimes it means that you're bringing clinicians or patients in front of the agency saying, open that door, let us through. Look, we're safe enough. Efficacy can be proven later. We'll make it clear that some of this is unknown, but let us get out there and try. And sometimes the agency may say no. Other times it may say yes. We're not here to be the judge of which is right and wrong in this case, but it certainly is an interesting example in an area, ALS, that's near and dear to my heart, as it affected our family very directly in years past. Well, that's about it for MedTech Crossroads today. We're looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll always give 30 seconds at the end if anyone has a question, a comment, or another local event to announce that we missed. We'd love to hear from you. But hope everyone's ramping up into the school season and having a great time getting back into the swing of things. I hate to admit this, but sometimes I really like getting back to that kind of a routine that comes with fall. So hope you're enjoying it too. We'll talk to you next week on MedTech Crossroads. Bye-bye.